All right. Well, everyone, thank you for joining CleanAIRE NC's overview of air quality permitting in North Carolina. This presentation today is done in part by our superstar intern, Andrew Rossetti, who is on the screen above me. Andrew is a rising senior at Duke University, and he was loaned to us thanks in part to a donation from the university, and we've been just overjoyed to have him with us for the past few months. And this is the topping, I guess, to his time with us. So I wanted to thank him for all of the hard work that he's given us this summer. And I know
Maybe they'll tell us.
I know that what everyone will learn today will be incredibly valuable. I did also want to mention that he's going to go through a set of slides, and we're actually going to send those slides to everyone who signed up today. And they will be a little bit different than what you see here. They'll be a bit more in-depth, but we hope that folks can use those slides as a resource and as a tool for, I know there are a lot of other organizations that are with us and a lot of other advocates. So hopefully they can share those with their membership and their advocates. So Andrew, thank you very much. I'll let you introduce our special guests, and it's all you. Good luck.
Thank you, Joel. So as Joel mentioned, I'm Andrew, and I've had the pleasure of joining CleanAIRE NC this summer as an environmental policy associate. One of my ongoing projects has been to research and summarize the air permitting landscape in North Carolina. So I'm excited to showcase some of those findings. And I'm very pleased to be joined by three guests from the Division of Air Quality. Heather Sands, the engineering supervisor at the Division of Air Quality, Mark Suella, the chief of the permitting section at the Division of Air Quality, and Zainab Nassif, the public information officer. And I will give them each an opportunity during the Q&A to more formally introduce themselves. But just to keep things flowing, I will go on to Premiere. All right, so the goals for today's presentation are to review the different permit types, so the broad classifications used in permitting in the state, to explore the process of permitting in North Carolina, and then to touch on the public engagement side of permitting. So I'll do that by beginning with a bit of an overview of what air permitting is and the rules that govern air permitting in North Carolina. Then we'll discuss the permit types, look a bit at the process, and then move on to public engagement and our Q&A. So first things first, ultimately an air permit is a tool used to ensure compliance and enforcement of the requirements laid out in the Clean Air Act. So these documents contain a wealth of information on the regulated pollutants and pollution sources at each facility, the standards that apply to those sources, as well as general monitoring and reporting requirements and ongoing compliance obligations. It's worth noting that there are two types, or permits are issued either by the EPA or by state and local agencies. The Part 70 permits are issued by state and local agencies, and Part 71 are issued by the EPA. The EPA issued permits are much less common though, so we are going to just be focusing on state level permitting today. An air permit may be needed if a facility desires to either construct a greenfield or new facility that has no existing permit, if they want to modify an already permitted facility, or even just renewal, name or ownership change, and administrative amendments. In North Carolina, it is the Division of Air Quality that oversees the permitting process, and they permit facilities based at the broadest level by potential emissions into one of three classifications. So either a Title V synthetic, minor, or small, with Title V being the largest polluters and small facilities being the smallest polluters. In North Carolina, the air quality permitting application process begins when a facility is either constructing a new facility or making a modification that requires a permit, and they will start by first identifying all of the regulated emission sources and exempt emission sources, and submitting the according documentation and application forms, which can be found on the DEQ's website. The DAQ engineers will then review the process rates and emission factors within the application documents and use these figures to calculate expected emissions. And as I mentioned, it is these expected or potential emissions that are used to identify the classification of each facility. From there, based on the applicable rules and regulations for that facility, the Division of Air Quality will draft enforceable, that being the keyword, permit requirements based on the whatever rules and regulations they found for that facility. If the facility merits public comment, so either it's a Title V facility or it's in the best interest of the public, then it will be open to public hearing, at which point people may request they may request a hearing on the draft permit, or issue and submit public comments. But we'll circle back to that towards the end. After that, any final edits are made before issuance of the permit or requests for supplemental information. So I want to get on with the rules and statutory authority underlying the permitting program in North Carolina, starting first with 40 CFR Part 70, so Title 40, the Code of Federal Regulations, Part 70, which is the State Operating Programs section. And effectively, this just outlines the components and process that states should follow while they are structuring the rules for their own state level permitting program. And those state rules are laid out in the North Carolina Administrative Code, Title 15A. So the North Carolina Administrative Code is a compilation of administrative rules for state agencies and occupational licensing boards. And the two relevant subchapters within Title 15A are subchapter 2Q and subchapter 2D. So subchapter 2Q is air quality permit procedures and it lays out the procedures and guidelines that the Division of Air Quality in North Carolina will follow in not only structuring their permitting process, but also administrating it and throughout oversight and ongoing permitting action. Whereas the more specific, pollution standards, source listings, et cetera, are contained within subchapter 2D, which is the air pollution control requirements. So if you're looking for specific information on the different types of polluters or polluting sources, different sorts of pollutants, et cetera, then that is where you will look for that information. And then quickly touching on the relevant federal standards and programs, a facility is required to comply with any and all applicable federal standards, assuming there's no exemption, in addition to or in conjunction with the requirements of its state air permit. So the first federal standard that I want to touch on is the National Emission Standards for Hazardous Air Pollutants, or NESHAP, which applies to a published list of, it's a pretty broad list of industrial sources, and effectively it requires the use of one of two technology-based emission standards. The first of those standards it's either maximum achievable control technology or generally available control technology. And the differentiator here is really how stringent the standards are. So the maximum achievable control technology, or MACT, applies to primarily major sources of pollution that are subject to NESHAP, and is more stringent than the generally available control technology, which typically applies to minor sources of pollution that are subject to NESHAP. And then the new source review program is a pre-construction permitting that relates to attainment of national ambient air quality standards, or NAAQS. There are two types of NSR permits: the prevention of significant deterioration, or PSD, and non-attainment NSR, which has a few different acronyms, but I went with NAA NSR. The PSD permits apply to facilities that are located in areas that are in attainment with the national ambient air quality standards. So the air quality in that area meets or exceeds the national standards laid out in NAAQS for the criteria pollutants. And these facilities, if they are major polluters in an attainment area, will be subject to best available control technology, which is a moderately stringent control standard that applies to major sources and requires maximum emission reductions, but on a case-by-case basis, meaning that cost considerations will be brought in, as will the impacts of this reduction. Whereas on the other hand, the major new source review in non-attainment areas applies to facilities that are located in areas that are not meeting the national ambient air quality standards, are not in attainment, and they are subject to lowest achievable emissions rate, which relative to the PSD, best available control technology, is more stringent, and it does not account for costs, impacts, or similar factors. Furthermore, in this case, the emission offsets are required, as is a cost-benefit analysis, and there must be a net air quality benefit from the project. And again, this is because the facility is located in an area that is not meeting national air quality standards. And then just quickly, the new source performance standards are pretty similar to the NESHAPs that I touched on earlier, apply to a number of industrial sources. The differentiator here would be that compared to NESHAPs, they have the additional requirement of testing to verify compliance. And then the accidental release prevention and risk management rules apply to facilities with a disproportionately high risk due to accidental releases. And so they'll be required to assess hazards, draw up plans to prevent accidents, and then also develop contingency plans or emergency response programs to handle those accidents if they do occur. Moving on to the classifications of permits, I'm going to talk about the three different permit types in North Carolina. The first of which is Title V. So as I mentioned, the classification of a facility is based on that facility's potential emissions in a given year. So Title V permits are given to facilities that have potential emissions of a major source, and the major source threshold is outlined in that figure or that graph on the right. So if a facility emits 100 tons per year or more of at least one regulated air pollutant, 10 tons per year or more of at least one hazardous air pollutant, or 25 tons per year or more of any combination of hazardous air pollutants, then it will qualify as a Title V facility. And it is worth mentioning that certain non-major sources, so certain sources that don't exceed this emissions threshold, can also be subject to Title V permits, such as specific non-major sources subject to NESHAP and NSPS, as well as affected sources under the federal acid rain rules and certain incinerators. The Grady White Boats facility in North Carolina provides one example of what is relatively simple facility, a Title V facility. So you can see on the left there that it is a Title V facility with a minor PSD class. They have the three emission sources listed in that top table. This kind of gives you a sense of the contents of a permit and what it will look like. You can see that each of those sources is subject to NESHAP's maximum achievable control technology. And then the regulated pollutants at this facility are also listed below. This facility is a Title V because of its hazardous air pollutant emissions. And in order to avoid the applicability of PSD, or prevention of significant deterioration, they've committed to 2 PSD avoidance conditions, which limit their emissions of volatile organic compounds and nitrogen oxides to a maximum of 250 tons per year. Moving to synthetic minor permits, a synthetic minor facility has potential emissions that exceed the aforementioned major source threshold. But in order to be permitted as synthetic minor, these facilities will accept federally enforceable limitations that keep their emission levels below major source thresholds. So these aren't just committing to keeping pollution below X level or emissions below X level, but actual physical and operational limitations that will hold a facility accountable to that. And so there are any number of limitations that might be put onto a facility, from operating hours to certain fuel mixes, et cetera. The key differentiator here, though, is that a synthetic minor facility is in effect a Title V polluter that takes on controls to reduce its emissions below Title V levels. One example of a Title V or a synthetic minor, facility is the Smithfield processing plant in North Carolina, or one of the Smithfield processing plants in North Carolina, which includes a boiler plant, rendering operation, meat processing plant, and wastewater for a total of 18 emission sources and cleaning devices. This facility is subject to NSPS and NESHAP and the risk management rule that I also mentioned. But as you can see, so it's a relatively complex emission profile, so to speak, but the key part to note here is the limitations that they take on in order to avoid Title V applicability. So they agree to limit their emissions of particulate matter, and you can see all of them there, PM10, SO2, VOC, and CO to 100 tons each for the Title V limitations. And similar to the Grady White facility, they also pursued 3 avoidance conditions for the PSD permitting. And just to note, the synthetic minor process is, in terms of fees, it's much cheaper for a facility to apply as synthetic minor, and it's a much less complex process. So in that regard, if a facility is reasonably able to limit their emissions below Title V thresholds, then there is some incentive to do so. And last, we have small, or sometimes called true minor permits. Small facility has no potential to exceed major source emission thresholds. And in fact, if it is small enough, it may pursue to either register or exempt itself. So meaning that there are really 3 options for a small facility. It can either have an air quality permit, register, or be exempted. And registration applies to small sources, so smaller than just a normal permitted small facility. So emissions are greater than or equal to 5 tons for any pollutant, but less than 25 tons for all pollutants combined. And this process is a lot simpler than the permitting process, though the facility is still subject to inspection and any and all applicable emission standards. And then the exemption applies to very, very small sources, so less than 5 tons of emissions of each pollutant and less than 10 tons for all pollutants. And these facilities do not have permit requirements, but again, any and all applicable emission standards will still apply. One example of a small facility is the Ajinomoto plant in North Carolina. So Ajinomoto is a manufacturer of amino acid based products and food ingredients, and they operate in the health and beauty, food and pharmaceutical spaces. And as you can see on the left here, they have a number of permitted emission sources, including some fermenters, 5 process tanks with various processes, and then 4 natural gas fired boilers. 2 of these boilers are subject to the federal new source performance standards. And then they have a number of insignificant and exempt sources, 2 of which are diesel fired pumps subject to NESHAP, and then 1 generator that is also subject to NESHAP, so the maximum achievable control technology technological standards. And then they have a number of other small storage and process tanks. And ultimately, as you can see in the emissions inventory on the right side of this page, they, despite having a number of individual permitted sources and exempt sources, the capacity at this facility, or the capacity that this facility is operating at, is such that their emission levels come nowhere near the major source thresholds. And now I want to move into the topic of public participation. And so logistically, a Title V facility or a qualifying non-major facility will be open to public participation, meaning that the public will have the opportunity to submit comments on the permit or request a public hearing for the permit. And this begins when the DAQ releases a notice of intent to permit, at which point the public will have 30 days to draft and submit comments to either the DAQ engineer for the respective facility that they're commenting on, or the email address listed there. And then moving on to really this is by no means an exhaustive list of points to consider when drafting public comments, and this is why I'm particularly excited to have our guest from the DAQ here to sort of keep this conversation and these ideas rolling. But when drafting public comments, there are a number of things that one might consider, beginning at the broadest level with the classification of the facility or the permit type. So small, synthetic minor, or Title V. Just looking at a high level and seeing whether that permit meets the statutory requirements, if there's any significant areas of ambiguity or really any other issues that you feel are glaring issues and represent something that might be an issue for that classification. And then are monitoring and record keeping alone sufficient to ensure compliance? Is it possible that even if the monitoring and record keeping were sufficient in terms of the rules and requirements, that the facility might be able to or might violate its permit? And then looking elsewhere to other states and other facilities to see, are there any cases where another state or region has given a permit to a very similar facility that looks substantially different? Is this because there's an error or an issue on one side in the permit, or is it because the regulations differ from state to state? So digging in on that front, as well as broadly speaking, just any external factors that might influence the emission levels within the permit. So for example, that might include leakage at a facility, over or under use of a control device, etc. So that, and then I guess concluding is whether or not there's any other publicly available information that you feel should be included and is yet to be included. And so with that, I wanted to keep this quick because I'm excited to hear from our guests and hear some questions from the audience. But I would love to move into the Q&A and give each of our guests a moment to introduce themselves, and then field some questions from the audience.
Yeah, thank you, Andrew. And we've got the Q&A box open. So if folks have questions that they would like to ask our panelists or Andrew, please feel free to do so there. I think I jumped the gun a bit. I didn't introduce myself. I'm Joel Porter. I'm the policy manager with CleanAIRE NC. And with that, I'll turn it over to our distinguished guest, Heather Sands. Feel free to say hello. And you're on mute.
Sorry. I'm Heather Sands, and I am a permitting supervisor in the permitting section with the Division of Air Quality. I've been with DAQ since 2013, and I've been in the environmental business since 1991. So I'm a chemical engineer from NC State.
Wonderful. Mark?
I'm Mark Suella. I'm the Title V Permitting Chief, Central Office in Raleigh. I've been with the division. I'm in my 30th year. I've held roles as Title V Supervisor that Heather now sits in. I've been Air Quality Analysis Branch Supervisor, and I've also worked in the Rural Development Branch. So in my career, I've seen a little bit of it all.
So between the two of you, you guys are the permitting gurus at DAQ, at least some with a good amount of experience.
That's what our titles say, yes.
Well, given Andrew's presentation, is there anything that he covered that you would like to emphasize, or maybe that he missed, that you would highlight for folks on the call to know more about? Anything that I'll open up to you just as a broad question. What are some things maybe that he missed or that he didn't, that you really want to drive home?
I think this presentation, in reviewing it, is a good 101 basic of who we permit, the size of the facilities, obviously. But generally, I think that the material Andrew provided was quite accurate, and absent of a specific focused question, I'm not real sure what else I would want to drive home as you put it out. Gotcha.
Well, one thing that popped up for me was the example he used with Smithfield. Smithfield's an agricultural company, and that kind of brought to light a question about what does and does not have to obtain an air emission permit in our state. Andrew covered all of the statutes, I think, at least the big broad ones that trigger a permit. But why is it that some agricultural permits don't require air emission permits from you all?
Well, permitting in general of an air emission source obviously is part of the rules that Andrew covered. Within both the Title V and the non-Title V worlds, there exists classes of sources that are exempt. Either because, I'll use Title V because that's what I'm most familiar with, because they're categorically exempt, meaning that their emissions are just ones that aren't regulated at all. There are no reason to include. A good example would be your HVAC unit at a facility, or mobile sources. Those are permitted elsewhere, but you don't have to write permits for those. And then there's the class of sources that are exempt from permitting due to their size. And in most cases, it's a 5-ton threshold or 1,000 pound of HAPs. If your potential emissions, looking at source by source, are less than those thresholds, then they do not need to have specific permitting requirements.
Thank you. That makes sense. We got a question from a Mecklenburg County Air Quality Commissioner, Rosa Mustafa, and I'm not totally sure that I understand the question, but I'm going to try to ask it in a way that hopefully does it justice. So there are, let me see, there are a lot of groups, including our own, have some concerns with environmental justice related issues. How does the division maybe take environmental justice concerns into account in their permitting or in approving a permit, or however you guys look at a permit, right, and decide what to do with it? How are those kinds of issues addressed? What can you share about about how you consider those kinds of issues?
Former Secretary Regan, when he was in the position that he vacated to move to Washington, he developed the EJ program that is run by the department. Each of the divisions were asked to provide a list of what we call triggering applications that automatically involve the next level of the environmental justice reviews. Those are for air quality. Those triggering are all PSD applications, all Greenfield Title V's, and then the third trigger are those activities or sources that the director feels there is going to be or already presents a significant public interest. When those applications arrive, we let the department know that we've received a triggering application, and then they start their review. Essentially what they do is put a pin in the facility, draw a circle around it, and then review what is inside that circle. They analyze the community members based on socio and economic mechanisms, education, race, and other factors. And they just merely, using the census data, report those out in a summary report. And that summary report is linked to that application, and the air quality aspect of it is usually just a summary of what that application is for and an emissions delta. Ultimately, that EJ report is to guide the division on any advanced level notification process for this public engagement type of things. For example, it may say that the public notice should be translated into Spanish or another language, or suggest that, community leaders be contacted, whether it be through church organizations or whatever. So that's the process and the procedure. And it's still, I keep saying now it's relatively new, but it's probably 2 years old now. Heather, do you have anything you might want to add on that?
No, I was just agreeing with you that we've been doing it for a couple of years, and when we announce permits that go to notice, if there has been an environmental justice review performed for that permit application, we post that along with the permit so that the public has access to it.
Correct.
So in those instances where people have concerns, we listed a few things to take into account when reviewing a permit and commenting on a permit. Are there other resources that might help people? Are there parts of a permit that people should hone in on, or are there resources that folks can use to maybe make a little more sense of permits when crafting their comments to you?
No, that's a good question. And I think an individual's choice to comment is based on what they are concerned with. We receive comments that range from highly technical to those that are just in opposition of a facility, in what it does. So, we treat all comments equally. They're all recorded as part of the hearing record, if there is a hearing, or if they're summarized in the statement of basis, our technical review that is accompanies all our permits. But there's no real training on how community can comment, for lack of better words. I mean, all the information that we have on the facility is available to you all, whether that be the permit application, prior compliance records, existing and past permits. All of those probably would help a commenter form what they may be concerned with.
So we actually had a question coming about enforcement. Have there been times that permits are withdrawn due to facilities not staying in compliance, or because of the adverse impacts to communities that may arise from health impacts because of the pollution or emissions that come from facilities, or other reasons?
Yeah, I'm not an enforcement expert at all, but the way the process typically works is through some investigation, whether it is a facility inspection or some other mechanisms, it is determined that a facility is not complying with their permit. Through the course of that investigation, through our compliance branch, notices of deficiency or violations can be generated. I am not aware of a time when the division has not denied a permit, but withdrew the ability of a facility to operate. What we enter into quite often are SOCs, which are schedules of compliance. So in addition to the violations that have been recorded and any fines that may have to go along with those, our SOCs put forth a schedule hopefully to bring that facility back into compliance. And it could require anything from the installation of controls to addition of permit restrictions. That's usually the mechanism to go from permit through enforcement back to permitting. But again, I don't know historically if we've ever retracted a permit that we've issued.
Gotcha. And we actually had another question from a member of the Mecklenburg Air Quality Commission. And this goes back to the question of EJ and the process that you use in evaluating environmental justice concerns. Do you guys go through any special training for that? Or do you guys, in that process, do you maybe hand it off to another evaluator in terms of going through those? Just trying to get a sense of...
that's exactly what happens. Our people, because this is at the departmental level, our people have not been trained in the tool. The tool is it's a departmental tool. It's based off of EPA's environmental justice tool, EJ screen. It's a very similar process. Again, our engineers are sort of hands off of all of that. We just let the department know, and then the department runs with the creation of those documents. Our engineers are only responsible for providing, as I said, a summary of the project as part of that review. So no, our people have not been trained in it. So yeah.
Cool. I see. What measures were put in place, if you all know of these, after the Colonial Pipeline spill in 2020? Were any safety measures implemented following that incident? That may be a bit outside of your realm since you guys are more permitting than enforcement, but if you want to take a whack at it, feel free.
I'm looking to Heather on this one.
I am not aware of what was put in place. That I'm familiar with what happened on a very superficial level, but not with respect to air emissions.
Right.
So
That's what and not knowing any details myself, the air component of it. So the department may, within another division, have put in
right.
measures, but I don't know of any in air.
Gotcha. Yeah, sorry we can't get a better answer for you, Rosa. But maybe that's one we can come back to later. Are you seeing any trends in air permitting over the years? That's a fairly broad question. Maybe do you see, maybe try to answer that from an economic standpoint. Do you see, and feel free, that question's from June Blotnick, our executive director, actually. So feel free to clarify if you want, but do you, in times of economic prosperity, do you see more applications being submitted during?
Well, I've most recently, obviously, we've been tracking applications due to the pandemic, and we've actually not seen a fall off
Right.
pre-pandemic numbers to now. The incoming application rate is just as high as it was.
Yep.
So,
One thing that I can say that we've started to see is a lot more community engagement, though. We have been holding more public hearings with facilities that normally would not have public hearings or not required to have public hearings. So we've had a lot more community engagement in the last couple of years.
yeah,
or the last few years, I should say.
right. And if there's any trend, and it's not even a trend, but because our applications, when they are entered into our system, essentially go live on our website, we see a lot more of upfront requests for copies of those applications. So to Heather's point, communities and environmental groups such as yourself, we realize that we're being watched and our applicants are being watched. And so there's a lot more of upfront requests for those types of send me a copy of the application. All right. That kind of stuff.
Well, we're glad to see there's more participation from our standpoint, and we do appreciate that you guys make that kind of information accessible. June had a follow-up for us. How about in the number of Title V's? Are there more Title V's that you're seeing come online?
As the number of sheer facilities, we are currently around the 295. In any one year, it's plus or minus 5. We get just as many that come in greenfield or move up in class from smaller synthetic minor as we do go down. So we're staying pretty constant at about 295 Title V facilities. I think we have some 600 synthetic minors. I just ran those numbers this week. I think I should know them. And a couple 1,500 to 2,000 small facilities in the state.
Wow. In terms of the permitting process, do you all liaison with other non-permitting or other state agencies at all?
We will interact with other states where we have questions on applicants that or facilities that may be new to us, and we reach out to other states to get their experience on it. Their permits are public information as well, so we share permits and try to plagiarize as much as we can. As long as the science is there and it is supported by application, we're not afraid to use similar language from another state's permit.
Particularly when it comes to federal rules.
Mm-hmm.
And when they're, federal rules are new or newly amended, we some of the, review engineers will seek out other states and how those particular provisions were handled in other permits.
Interesting. So building on that question, COVID has changed the way everything is done, right? I mean, here we are right now on Zoom. Following the pandemic, if we ever get back to a point where we can all, go back to normal, will you continue using virtual engagement as a form of soliciting community feedback? Is this kind of built in now going forward, or do you think that might go away, or what's the general thinking in terms of bringing in some of those distant communities in the more rural parts of the state and ensuring that they have continued engagement?
I have to say that this has been a topic of discussion, and we're sort of tied a little bit to what the general statutes require. For example, the statutes require committee meetings, like our Environmental Management Committee and our Air Quality Committee, to meet physically on schedules. And that during the COVID time period, that was waived due to safety concerns, of course. So ultimately, they will have to revert to face-to-face meetings. We, by default, applied those face-to-face meetings that we were having, our public meetings or public hearings at the site of a facility or in the county where a facility is located. Due to the travel restrictions and safety precautions, we went virtual. We don't yet know if we will have to revert back to physical meetings. We understand that there are pros and cons of both virtual and in-person meetings, and we're also aware of the technical difficulties in trying to do a combination virtual in-person meetings. So right now we're still acting under a virtual process, but I don't know if we'll have to revert. And if we revert, most likely it'll be 100%. It'll be back to straight face-to-face with no virtual component. That's my guess.
Well, I think speaking for a lot of us on this call here today and us as well, we hope that it continues. We view this as a tool that has really allowed a lot of communities to access things they maybe otherwise would have never had the opportunity to do. Mm-hmm. And there are still a lot of communities that struggle with access to Wi-Fi and broadband and all of that. So there are other obstacles that need to be overcome as well. But that's a much bigger discussion that, maybe isn't appropriate for this venue. We got a question about ongoing engagement that maybe I can take actually. CleanAIRE NC does regularly try to engage communities on the permitting process. We're going to have this recorded webinar actually on our website, so folks can come refer to this whenever they would like. And we hope to be able to point to this as a resource. And we're also going to be sending out the slide deck or a version of the slide deck that is much more detailed and has a lot more information about the statutory requirements of permitting and a lot of other stuff in it that we hope folks can utilize going forward. And we're going to email that to everybody who's joined us today. So yes is the answer to that question.
I wanted to, if you don't mind me interrupting, I wanted to also bring up that we have quarterly, I think they're quarterly, right, Mark? The outside involvement committee meetings. So every quarter, and it's held via WebEx. Right now, I think we've had it via WebEx for quite some time, plus in person, and now we just switched to just virtual. But that would be an opportunity for people to attend and ask questions of us on a more regular basis if that was something that they were interested in.
I was on the call yesterday and it was very detailed and in-depth, and I appreciate you all taking the time to put those meetings together. Could the department utilize more of the mapping tools that have been built and that the EPA has in ways that identify where there are high concentrations of PM, particulate matter, and contaminants in communities? Could there be more of that done? If you want.
I'm not certain. The mapping tool that I'm familiar with is the component of the whole layers, and I thought that was mostly the demographics, again based off of the census, and our EJ tool is based off of that mapping. I'm not certain of if there's any layers of emissions. If that's where the comment is trying to push it towards. So I'm not certain of that answer. So
Okay, that's fair, I think. In terms of community engagement, how are those events like the OIC, the Outside Involvement Committee, how are those advertised and marketed? And maybe let's take that question a bit further with respect to permits and hearings. And maybe if you could just for a second go into how you advertise to communities, and maybe if you, let's keep going with it, especially communities that might be considered EJ communities or community BIPOC communities, how do you get the word out, so
Sure.
to speak, to those groups that there's a hearing taking place and you'd like their feedback?
Sure. There are multiple ways. Statutorily, we are required for those permits that have to have a public notice component. Those generally are limited to the Title V facilities. The smalls and the synthetic minor typically do not have, or by rule, do not have a public hearing, public notice component unless there is a director's discretion, for lack of better words. So in the Title V world, we're breaking it up into PSD and Title V. For Title V renewals or synthetic minors, our requirement is only that they go on our website. When we propose a draft permit, public notice, the draft permit, the draft review will be posted on our website. For PSD and for Title V greenfields, we not only post it on our website, but we put it in a paper of general circulation around the facility. Those advertisements are broadcast out on an email blast. Anybody can ask to be placed on that email list, and they will receive every single one that we send a notice, whether it's in their county or not. And they correspond to approximately the same time that we would put it in the newspaper. So, you know, if your membership would like to be added to that, or an individual in your membership would like to be added to that Title V list, you just need to get us a name and email, and we can add you. I think right now it's probably got about 50 persons on it. So not real big, but it is a useful tool, and it is one that we're required to use. So yeah, that's one mechanism. And then we understand the newspapers are hit and miss. If you're not looking for it, it's easy to miss a legal ad, because we're only required to run it one time, 30 days prior to a hearing, or if there is no hearing, it's just an advertisement opening up the comment period for a 30-day period. The majority of our Title Vs that have to go through both a public notice period also have a corresponding 45-day EPA review period. Those two periods run in parallel. Unless we receive a significant amount of public comment that requires us to modify either the permit or the review. In that event, we have to take into account all comments, adjust those documents as necessary and as appropriate, and then we send it down to EPA to begin their 45 days. So they go from parallel to sequential. And it's not until both of those periods are over before we can issue a permit. But again, those are for the heavy hitters. Those are renewals, first time Title V's or significant modifications. And a significant is defined as one that in most cases, a significant modification is one that contravenes or goes against an existing condition that's already in a permit.
Gotcha. And I put Kathy Hash's email address in the chat.
Yeah.
And that's who you send a request to get on that Title V list that you mentioned.
That is correct.
I'm gonna post our permitting website address as well. That's got some other information.
That would be great. That'd be great. And let me quickly, we're running up on time, so let me open it up to Andrew again, and since this was his project. Andrew, is there anything throughout the course of this that you've been aching to ask our other panelists here? Any questions that you have outstanding that you haven't had covered here today?
Yeah, I only have one question. Not particularly related to public engagement, but I was wondering, I know you mentioned earlier the sort of, when it comes to exemption, there's the categorical exemptions, and then there's the exemptions based on just the size of the facility or the amount of pollution from a facility. Is that so when it comes to like non-major sources that are effectively marked up to Title V, is that something that happens frequently? Like, are there categorical, like minor sources that are consistently permitted as Title V? Because I saw a few things online that alluded to that, but I couldn't really find any instances where a non-major source was permitted as Title V.
Again, I think your slides covered it. In most cases where a facility their potential is below Title V. There are a few cases where they are required to hold a Title V permit. And in most of those cases, it is due to the applicability of a federal standard, just as you pointed out. An example would be copper.
I was gonna give an example for the, oh, no, I've lost it. The facility, I got the facility, but there's some of the standards say, even if it's an area source,
right,
they have to get a Title V permit.
One real good example are air quality incinerators or air quality burners. These are portable units that you find mostly by operations of land clearing. And it's a mechanical fan that allows for a better combustion for the destruction of land clearing debris. That is a federal rule that requires these mobile units to hold a Title V permit, which is in no way would they'd have to, in order for them to admit at a Title V threshold, I don't think they can physically burn that much.
Right.
Great, thank you. And that's my only question, but I just want to say thank you again so much for joining us. It's been awesome to hear from you guys on all of this, and it really, I don't know, I think it was very great insight that we'd definitely never be able to have if it weren't for you joining us today.
Agreed. Thank you very much, Mark, Heather. We appreciate the time that you guys took for us today. And Andrew, you did a wonderful job. Thank you
I
very much.
agree. I think that the presentation was very well done for someone who is not involved with air quality.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Well, you never know. Maybe this
all
could
those,
be enough.
all those 3-letter acronyms.
Absolutely. Well, thank you guys again, and we will be in touch.
All right.
Bye,
Thanks,
everyone.
everybody.
Thank you.